There are places in Oxford where time stands still not out of reverence, but out of reluctance. The chapel at St. Frideswide's was one of them, a Gothic refusal to modernize, to yield to halogen or central heating or even proper signage. You had to know where it was to find it. The entrance lay behind an iron gate wreathed in ivy, half hidden down a cloister that always smelled faintly of mold and memory. That evening, it must have been early November, I went not for any case, nor out of obligation, but because I couldn't quite face going home. The air in the chapel was as still as folded parchment, and the kind of cold that doesn't prick but sinks. Into the wrists, the back of the neck, the chest. A thin shaft of dusk light came through the upper windows, slicing through the dust like a scalpel. Someone was lighting candles along the altar, an old man with a lantern jaw and stooped back, who moved like someone accustomed to being overlooked. I later came to know him as Arnold Lacey, though at the time he was simply the verger. I remember him pausing at the sixth candle. It flared, then faltered, then went out. He didn't relight it. The choir began to gather, their soft chatter echoing in that particular way only stone knows. I took my usual seat, back left, 2 rows from the last pillar, close enough to listen, far enough not to be noticed. I didn't believe in God, not in the Anglican one, not really in any. But I believed in Evensong. Or perhaps I believed in the idea of it. Ritual without consequence, music without demand. The boy sopranos filed in with folded hands and imperfect posture, and the first chord from the organ murmured its way into the bones of the building. She used to sing here. Not often, and never as a soloist, but her voice, low, certain, untrained, had lingered longer in my memory than any recording. Harriet. I hadn't thought of her in years, and yet that night, as the choir reached the Magnificat's final descant, her face arrived unbidden, like an old photograph sliding loose from the back of a drawer. It made me miss things I had no right to miss. The service ended. The verger snuffed the candles save one. It flickered as I passed, the only remaining light in a space that already felt like it had forgotten me. I nodded to him, and he, I'm sure of this now, looked straight through me. Not out of rudeness, but because his thoughts were somewhere else entirely. There was a strange stillness to him, not just of body, but of purpose, as though he'd already reached the end of something. The next morning, Lewis brought the paper in with his usual mildly apologetic air, as if the news might be improved by the manner of its delivery. Found him in the vestry. Sat up in the chair. Looked peaceful, they say. Natural causes. I asked if there had been a post-mortem. He shook his head. Doctor signed it off straight away. Known heart condition. Chap's nearly 80. No family, no fuss. You know how it goes. I did. Or thought I did. Until, a few hours later, an envelope arrived, unsigned, typed on a machine that slightly misaligned its T's, and postmarked no more than 5 miles from Carfax Tower. The candle went out too early. That was all it said. No name, no accusation, just a single sentence. But it was enough. It's always something like that. Not the body, not the motive, not even the alibi. It's the off note. The word that doesn't quite fit the sentence. The phrase that sounds rehearsed. The candle that goes out when it shouldn't. And the person who notices. I folded the note in half and slipped it into my inside coat pocket, where it would remain, warming slightly against my chest. I knew already that I wouldn't be able to let it go. I should have, of course. There was no evidence, no inquiry opened. Just an old man in a cold chapel, a life folded closed like the last page of a hymnal. But the choir had sung slightly off-key that evening. The third baritone came in half a beat late on the Nunc Dimittis, the kind of thing no one would remark on, except me. I've often thought the most dangerous communications are the ones we never intended to send. Or perhaps it's the opposite, the ones we claim we never meant to. Either way, a letter without a name, typed in haste and silence, carries a weight that ink never quite manages. It was Lewis who brought it, of course, folded and sealed and humming with unsaid things. He handed it to me without ceremony, the way a man gives another a forgotten umbrella. I opened it in the half-light of my sitting room, where late afternoon had already turned to something resembling dusk. The candle went out too early. 7 words. Cold, precise. No signature, no salutation. Just a line of text with a sense of finality and faint, unacknowledged grief. The typewriter's alignment was imperfect, the T's in out and 2 dipped just below the line, as if reluctant to stand upright. That detail stayed with me more than it should have. Machines, like people, develop quirks when no one is watching. I asked Lewis about the envelope. Postmarked Oxford 2 nights ago. The paper was standard, the kind issued by the university print shop. I thought of the man who'd sent it, or woman, likely someone who had stood in the chapel that evening, or perhaps someone who had simply heard the music through stone walls and knew what was missing. There was no investigation open. The death certificate had already been filed. Cardiac arrest, long-standing condition. The sort of verdict one accepts with a shrug. Arnold Lacey, verger and minor historical footnote, had not been important enough to murder. But something had struck the sender. Something, the flicker of a candle, perhaps, or the tremble of a hand, had unsettled them into action. I've learned to respect such small dissonances. They're like an unresolved chord in a fugue, inaudible at first, and then, when you finally hear it, you can't unhear it. Lewis sat across from me, tapping the envelope as though trying to coax more out of it. Probably someone having a bit of fun. These types, they get ideas. You know, he didn't mean it cruelly, but he always needed cause, Lewis. A foot on the rung. I, on the other hand, had always responded to absence, silence, gaps between words. I asked him to stall the file. Just for a day or 2. A quiet pause. He looked at me the way people do when you open a book in the middle and insist the ending is hidden there. Later, I found myself walking again. Back to the chapel. No purpose. Not really. It had begun to rain, that gentle, misty kind of rain that isn't quite water but still manages to reach the spine. I arrived just before Evensong. The building was the same. Of course it was. The organist had already begun her warm-up. Fractured chords, fragments of psalms. The choir boys loitered at the edge of the pews, all fidget and half-tucked shirts. I watched from the rear, pretending to read one of the well-worn prayer books, though I didn't turn the page. Something was different, though I couldn't name it. I closed my eyes, not in reverence, but in recollection, and when I opened them again, I saw it. The far choir stall, second from the end. The varnish was newer. A brighter finish. Barely noticeable unless you had reason to look. The rest of the wood had darkened with age and sweat and candle smoke. But not that one. I asked myself whether Lacey had noticed, whether he had asked, whether someone had answered too quickly. On the way out, I passed the candles again. This time they were all lit. Steady, unwavering. No sign of failure. And yet I couldn't help imagining it. That quiet puff, the smoke rising, the absence unannounced. I returned home to silence. The crossword lay half-finished on the table. 11 across, still unanswered. An ending misread as peace, 7. I hadn't solved it that morning, and I didn't now. Instead, I reread the letter, folded it once more, slipped it into the drawer beside the whiskey. I didn't believe in accidents, not the meaningful kind. There are sounds one remembers not because they were loud, but because they did not belong. The scrape of a chair in an empty room, a match striking too slowly, a cough, precisely when one should not occur. I was reminded of this, or rather, I remembered having been reminded, when I spoke to Mrs. Digby in the organ loft, 2 days after Lacey's death, and some untraceable part of me began to turn. The chapel was empty. No service, no rehearsals, just her and the long, patient ranks of keys waiting to be pressed. She was not young, but age had made her less frail than precise, like something sharpened over time. She had the manner of someone who had once been a contralto and never entirely forgiven the world for not noticing. She played a few hesitant bars as I stood at the rail. A Purcell prelude, I think, or something very like it. I asked if she had noticed anything unusual during Evensong. Not the one before. The one before that. The one where I first noticed the faulty candle. She thought for a moment, her fingers still resting on the keys. I remember the soprano section being unusually ragged, she said, and one of the boys had a cold. But that's not what you're asking. She looked at me then, not searchingly, not suspiciously, just the way someone does when they've been holding on to something and are wondering whether to let it go. I heard a cough. She said it plainly, as though it had just happened. Behind the vestry screen, soft, throat-clearing almost, but not quite. She had not mentioned it to anyone. Why would she? I thought it might have been Arnold himself, or one of the choristers. You know how they wander about. I nodded. Yes, they did. But I'd been there. I'd heard the music, not the cough. Perhaps I wasn't listening. Or perhaps it had come at precisely the wrong moment, not loud enough to register, but not quiet enough to forget. I asked if she could describe it again. It wasn't sick, she said. Not phlegmy. Just aware. Like someone making sure they were still there. That stayed with me. Not the sound, but the intention. A cough not to clear the throat, but to remind the world of your presence. Later, in the vestry, I examined the chair where they had found him. High-backed, wood-wormed, the seat cushion slightly worn on the right edge. There was a faint scuff on the floor beside it, just behind the table. Not deep, just enough to suggest someone had moved abruptly. Or perhaps not. 1,000 people passed through that chapel, and stone remembers slowly. What struck me wasn't what I found, but what I didn't. There was no book of hours, no notes for the next service, no hymn list. Lacey was meticulous. Everyone had said so. But there was an envelope, torn open at the top, carefully, as though by someone who disliked tearing, addressed simply A.L., no stamp, no postmark, hand-delivered or tucked discreetly beneath a door. The letter was missing. The envelope held only a faint trace of perfume, citrus and something older. Bergamot, maybe. The kind you find in antique drawers. I took it with me. Slipped it into the inside pocket of my coat, beside the earlier note. Together they formed a pair of absences, one unsigned, one unsent. The chapel bell rang, though I hadn't noticed the time. Outside, the rain had begun again, a quiet, unapologetic drizzle. I stayed a moment longer, standing in the threshold between nave and vestry, and listened. Not for voices, not for music, just for that cough. But of course, it was gone. It was Lewis who found the boy. I hadn't asked him to, not directly. Just mentioned in passing that I'd noticed one of the trebles hesitated during the psalm, barely a beat behind the others. Lewis, with that soft-edged sense of duty that always tried to match instinct, with procedure, tracked him down by choir register. Felix Rudge, 13, son of a mathematics lecturer, pale, narrow, possibly asthmatic, and possessed of that fragile confidence peculiar to boys who sing better than they speak. I met him in the sacristy, late afternoon, while the choir rehearsed above us. The walls pulsed faintly with sound, blurred chords seeping downward through stone. He sat perched on a bench that seemed too large for him, his blazer slightly too short at the sleeves, his fingers worrying at the frayed edge of a cuff. I asked him about Mr. Lacey, not in the manner of interrogation, more like someone trying to recall a shared acquaintance from long ago. He didn't speak at first. Then, as though deciding the question had waited long enough for its answer, he told me Mr. Lacey had seemed sad lately. Not unkind. Just as if he were trying to remember something important and failing, or perhaps trying not to. I asked if he'd noticed anything strange during the last service. He blinked, then nodded. Said Lacey had changed the hymn order 3 times that week. Felix had marked it down each time in pencil on the choir list. He showed me, with the solemnity of someone revealing a secret he hadn't realized was one. Tuesday, it had been, "Oh, for a closer walk with God. Then abide with me." But by Sunday, the order had reverted, though no one sang what was printed. That was unusual. These were not choices made lightly in ecclesiastical circles. And they were hymns of farewell, all of them, quiet exits dressed in melody. He hesitated then, hand still on the folded list, as if debating whether to speak further. He told me Mr. Lacey had given him a piece of paper, or, rather, dropped it while handing him the register. Felix had picked it up, meant to give it back, but something about the writing had caught his eye. He said it looked like a poem, but strange. Wrong, somehow. He pulled it from his blazer pocket, carefully unfolded, faintly crumpled. It was a single line. "He makes departure sweet, whose end is silence." I knew the line. Except I didn't. It was close to Donne, or rather, close to something attributed to Donne in a compilation of apocryphal quotations I'd read years ago in the Bodleian's locked stack. The real line was, "He makes departing sweet, whose death is peace." The falseness rang like a wrong note struck beneath a perfect chord, close enough to pass, until you truly listened. I asked Felix if he knew where Lacey kept his hymn selections. He pointed vaguely toward the vestry cabinet, a battered piece of walnut furniture that had seen more hands than sermons. I thanked him, told him he'd helped more than he knew. He looked at me then with something between embarrassment and pride. A child's sense of having mattered, just briefly, in the quiet machinery of adult lives. I let him go. Watched him walk across the chapel floor, footsteps barely audible. He paused at the chancel steps, or looked up as though checking the lights or remembering something. Then he was gone. Alone again, I turned the paper over in my hand. No watermark, no signature, just the words, slightly faded, in what looked like Lacey's own hand. But the ink had bled at one edge, as though handled with damp fingers, or left near a window when the rain blew sideways. Back in my study that evening, I opened my old volume of misattributed verse and searched for the line. There it was, marked in red from a note I'd written years before. I remembered dismissing it then as a poor imitation, but now it no longer felt like imitation. It felt like confession, a substitution made deliberately, not to obscure meaning, but to alter it. Death transposed into silence, departure into design. And that wrong note, that slight delay in the third bar of the hymn, echoed again. Not just a boy out of rhythm, but something else. Someone holding back. Deliberately. One beat too late. There's something about old paper that resists being touched. Not out of fragility, though that's the excuse we use, but because it knows more than we do. In the vestry that morning, the cabinet gave up its drawers easily, as if it too had grown tired of secrecy. I went alone. Lewis had been called away to something procedural, something measurable. I needed quiet. The registers sat in lined formation, neat as choir boys. Cream leather bindings with gold-dipped edges, each volume dated in tidy lettering. I pulled the one marked 1962-1964. Its cover gave a soft sigh. The pages were crisp, yellowing at the edges. Most were filled with handwritten entries. Baptisms, marriages, burials. Notes in the margins. Cross-references in ecclesiastical shorthand. And then, a gap. The page for May 1963 had been removed. Not torn, lifted. Cleanly, like a leaf removed from a herbarium by someone who knew how not to leave bruises. I checked the stitching. Deliberate, measured. The entries moved from the last day of April to the 1st of June as though nothing had ever happened in between. But even silence leaves residue. The ink pressure on the back of the previous page was lighter. Someone, long after the fact, had tried to avoid leaving a trace, and had failed, ever so slightly. I stood for a while with the book open in my hands, trying to imagine the sort of absence that requires removal. The dead leave names, paperwork, but shame, that's what gets erased. And only when it's too late to call it justice. The archivist arrived precisely 12 minutes late, in a state of minor disorder. Trousers too short, tie too long, glasses held together at the hinge with a sliver of tape. I'd called ahead, told him I had a few questions. He'd said, of course, as long as they weren't theological. His name was Troturn, thin-limbed, with the pallor of someone who'd never quite learned to trust natural light. He wore the expression of a man who regarded most human interaction as a necessary but inefficient form of administration. I showed him the register, asked if he knew anything about the missing page. "That's very strange," he said. "It shouldn't be missing." He didn't offer a theory, just stared at the binding as if it had betrayed him personally. I asked whether Arnold Lacey had ever requested to see this particular volume. Lacey. "Oh, yes. He came in 2 weeks ago. Said he wanted to check something about hymn selections during Lent that year. But this isn't the book for that. He should have used the liturgical calendar records." He was trying too hard to sound indifferent, the kind of distance people manufacture when the past feels a little too close. "Did he mention a name?" "No. Or if he did, I don't remember." His hands were fidgeting with the cuff of his cardigan, a nervous habit or perhaps just cold. I asked whether he'd known Lacey outside chapel. He paused, blinked, then gave a small, clipped laugh. "No, not really. I mean, everyone knew Arnold. He'd been around forever. But no, I wouldn't say we were close. He wasn't lying exactly. But the word close had stuck somewhere in the middle of his sentence like a sliver of bone in the throat. I closed the book, returned it gently to its slot. As he turned to go, I caught a detail I hadn't registered before. The ink smudge on his shirt cuff, faint and grey. The kind left by old fountain pens or from handling archival materials too carelessly, or perhaps too deliberately. I didn't stop him. Not yet. Instead, I remained in the vestry, the smell of beeswax and mildew surrounding me, and wrote the name Carr in my notebook. A guess, a memory, a ghost. Sometimes you don't know what's missing until the silence starts to repeat itself. Photographs lie, of course. Not in the way people do, not actively, not with intention, but in the way they preserve the surface and discard the sound. A still frame holds no hesitation, no tremble in the voice, no glance toward the door just before a confession. Only light, and even that, only for a moment. I found the photograph by accident, or rather, I found it because I was looking for something else. The chapel kept a small display cabinet near the rear pews, filled with detritus that someone had once decided mattered. A bishop's signet ring, a communion chalice from 1847, a program from an Evensong in honor of someone now forgotten. I don't know why I stopped. Perhaps it was the angle of the light. Dusk again, and the candles had just been lit. The photograph was slightly yellowed, mounted on black card. The label beneath read, St. Fridswide's Choir, Easter, 1963. 22 faces, arranged in 3 rows, all male. Robes crisply pressed, eyes mostly forward, but one face, second row, far left, had been scratched out. Not obliterated, but gently effaced, as though whoever had done it couldn't quite bring themselves to finish the job. I leaned closer. The damage had been done with something blunt, A fingernail, perhaps, or a coin edge. No attempt to disguise it, only to make it less seen. The verger was there, of course. Younger, clean-shaven, standing stiffly at the edge. His face, Arnold Lacey's, was unsmiling, though the corners of his mouth seemed to be making an effort. Beside him, hand on shoulder, stood a clergyman with a certain kind of confidence. Thick hair, strong jaw, a cassock that seemed to fit a little too well. I recognized him, not by name, not yet, but by reputation. There was a file once that Strange had shown me late one evening when we were both more tired than sober. Internal diocesan matter, nothing that reached the press. A quiet relocation, the church's way of folding things up without ever having unfolded them. Father Edward Carr. I hadn't thought of him in years, but there he was, in full view, preserved under glass, while the boy to his left had been erased by a fingertip. I asked the chapel steward about it. He was a short man with a short memory, though neither were entirely sincere. Said the display had been there for ages. Said people liked a bit of history. Said he couldn't recall who'd arranged it. Maybe Lacey himself. That detail stayed. Why would Lacey leave the photo out? Why include it at all, unless the act of placing it had its own quiet logic? Guilt, perhaps. Or a warning. Or simply the need to have something seen, even if not understood. Back at the station, I asked Lewis to pull diocesan archives. He grumbled, not out of protest, but because he knew what it meant. Knew we were moving from the outer edges of curiosity towards something colder. The kind of truth that doesn't announce itself, but waits. While he searched, I took a copy of the photograph from the chapel printer. Black and white, grainier now. At home, I laid it on the desk beside my unfinished crossword. 8 down, buried but not forgotten. 7. I stared at it a while. Then at the photo. The boy's absence gnawed, even the way his robes folded. There was weight to them. Whoever he was, he'd once had mass. Shape. And now, nothing but a blur of pressure where a face had been. I wondered if it was Lacey's hand that had scratched him out, or someone else's, and whether the intention had been to protect or to condemn. The photo meant something, that much I knew. It wasn't evidence, not yet. But it was a question, and the kind of question that doesn't go away. Outside, the bells of Magdalen rang Compline. Late again. I poured a finger of whiskey and stared at the glass. Light, frozen in time, flickers differently when held up to the dark. There are days when one retreats not for clarity, but for distance. I've never believed that insight arrives with fresh air and walking shoes. For me, it has always come through stillness, dust, the quiet guilt of oil paint slowly cracking in a forgotten frame. The Ashmolean offered that, and something else. A kind of anonymous silence. The sort of place where one could spend an afternoon unnoticed without having to explain the weight they brought in with them. I hadn't planned to go. But that morning, after Lewis's hesitant report on diocesan files, a name blacked out here, a resignation quietly filed there. I found myself drifting westward, coat collar up against a rain that never truly arrived. The museum was almost empty. A school group murmured near the Egyptian wing, shepherded by a teacher who looked as though he'd rather be anywhere else. I bypassed the mummies and the shattered urns. History has never interested me in its totality, only in its omissions, the things it chooses not to preserve. Upstairs, in a side gallery no larger than my kitchen, I found the Dutch still lifes, familiar territory, melancholy rendered through fruit and shadow, a pewter jug overturned, a lemon half-peeled, a bird, dead but painted with such care it looked as if it might flutter off the canvas if given one more breath. I lingered in front of one by Jan Weenix. It featured a curtain pulled aside to reveal a hunting scene. Stag, hound, the glint of a blade. But in the foreground sat a small silver clock. Its hands stopped at 4:20. Nothing in the composition required it, and yet there it was. Unchanging. Time, I thought, when painted, is more honest than when told. I don't know how long I stood there. Minutes, perhaps more, until I heard my name. Quiet, careful, like a librarian saying it into a dream. Harriet Mellor. She hadn't changed much. The same long scarf, the same unpolished boots, the same voice that always seemed to carry a question even when stating facts. She was still at St. Hilda's, teaching classics, if only just. Retirement loomed, though she would never use the word. She asked how I was, and I answered in a way that suggested I might still be deciding. I asked if she'd known Arnold Lacey. She nodded slowly. Arnold was gentle, I think, always half vanished. He knew when to step out of sight, which is a rarer virtue than people realize. And Father Carr? That name drew a pause. Not theatrical, just long enough to be heard. Too clever for his own goodness, she said, and not very good at being watched. I asked if she remembered the photograph. She did. It wasn't always in the case, she said. I think it appeared around the time Arnold started cataloguing the hymnals again. I don't believe he meant to draw attention. More the opposite. As if, she hesitated, as if placing it quietly might make something else disappear. She didn't elaborate, and I didn't ask her to. Instead, we moved to another gallery, the medieval one with its reliquaries and thornwood triptychs, a place built for the display of wounds, sacred and otherwise. We stood before a carved altarpiece showing the martyrdom of Saint Sebastian. Arrows everywhere. "Do you think we ever really forget?" she asked. "No," I said. "We just find quieter ways to remember." She touched my sleeve, briefly, and left. I remained, watching the saint's face, not in agony, but in something resembling peace. The artist, I thought, had misunderstood the nature of pain, or perhaps understood it too well. When I left the museum, the rain had started in earnest. No wind, just that steady Oxford drizzle that seeps into the joints and lingers. I didn't rush. Some things should be walked through slowly. It was Lewis, of course. He had that knack. Or maybe it was just diligence disguised as luck. The gift of finding precisely the thing I didn't yet know I was searching for. He appeared late that afternoon, damp around the edges and holding the folder like it might bite. Said he'd checked probate, just on a hunch, though we both knew it wasn't really a hunch. It was the quiet persistence of a man who reads everything and forgets nothing, especially when I pretend not to ask. The will was dated 2 weeks before Lacey's death. Typewritten, clean, witnessed by a church warden and the secretary from the bursar's office. All perfectly correct. It left everything, modest savings, a few personal effects, and an antique collection of choir scores, to St. Fritz Wyde's chapel for the preservation of its musical heritage. A bequest as orderly and featureless as the man who signed it. But tucked behind it, same folder, older paper, was the previous version. 2 years old. Same signature. Same hand. Different beneficiary. Celia Tranter. That name arrived like a dropped note in a silent room. I hadn't heard it in years. She'd been a soprano here once, years ago. Late 60s, perhaps early 70s. The kind of voice people describe with vague terms like haunting or pure, but which really meant untrained brilliance in a world that prefers Polish. I remembered her performance of O Rest in the Lord, one of the few renditions that ever made me regret not believing in redemption. Lewis, to his credit, didn't ask what I remembered. He only said she now lived in Jericho near Walton Crescent. Still taught music privately. No public performances for over a decade. I went that evening. The rain had faded to mist, and the air had that strange warmth Oxford sometimes produces at dusk, as though the stones, having stored enough cold, now offered a brief kindness. Her house was narrow, ivy-covered, unsentimental. A curtained light glowed in an upstairs window. She opened the door, not slowly, not reluctantly, but with a kind of preemptive stillness, as if she already knew it was me. She hadn't changed. The lines around her eyes had deepened, but they were the same eyes, the same quiet precision, the same unyielding refusal to explain herself. She let me in without comment. The hallway smelled faintly of varnish and lavender. We didn't sit. She stood at the edge of the doorway to what must have been a small parlor. Her hands were bare. No ring, no tremble. I asked if she'd heard about Arnold. She nodded, said she'd been expecting it. I asked if they'd been close. She paused, not because the answer was difficult, but because she knew the wrong one would settle too easily. We knew each other. Once. He was kind, and terribly afraid of things that hadn't yet happened. I told her he'd named her in a will, then removed her. She didn't look surprised, only a little tired. He thought it would keep me safe, she said. But men like Arnold forget that safety, once offered as explanation, becomes its own kind of prison. I asked what he'd been afraid of. Her smile didn't quite reach the corners of her mouth. Some men at Oxford never stopped paying for what happened in 1963. She offered nothing more, and I knew not to press. There are conversations that stop not because they've ended, but because they were never meant to begin. Back at home, I spread the two wills side by side. Same signature. Same deliberate curve in the capital A of Arnold. But the final one, the newer one, had a smudge on the bottom edge, a faint crescent as though someone had touched it just before the ink had dried. I held it up to the lamp. The date had been typed over once, the slight misalignment, the faint shadow of an earlier 3 beneath the 5. Not 2 weeks before his death, but days. A will changed in haste or under pressure, or fear. The crossword on my desk remained unfinished. 11 across, to revise something before it's too late. 7. Redraft. It fit, too neatly perhaps. But then, the truth often does. Until it doesn't, it was the clue that did it. Not the will, not the photograph, not even Celia's unfinished sentence left hanging like a half-remembered melody. It was 11 down, extinguished too soon, 9. A clue I'd glanced at days before and dismissed, telling myself it would come eventually, like sleep. But it didn't. And that evening it came not through effort, but accident. The kind of answer that waits until you've stopped asking. Premature. 9 letters. Each fitting perfectly, effortlessly, like a key that had been in your pocket all along. It should have brought satisfaction, but it didn't. Instead, it opened something. Not a solution, but a silence. Because I had read that word before. Not in a puzzle, in a line. He makes departure sweet whose end is silence. Except that wasn't it. Not really. The original, the one I'd thought apocryphal, tucked into the margins of some misremembered dawn, didn't speak of silence. It spoke of peace. He makes departing sweet whose death is peace. Not departure, not silence. Death. The alteration wasn't poetic license, it was intentional. A veiling. Someone had looked at the line and thought, no, that's too final. So they'd softened it. Departure, not death. Silence, not peace. The change was slight, barely noticeable, but it echoed now, precisely, with the crossword clue. Not because of the meaning, but because of the evasion. Premature. The candle, the hymn, the will, the boy's missing face. And now this, a word substituted so gently you'd almost miss it. I retrieved the scrap Felix had handed me, still folded in my drawer between the anonymous letter and the copy of the register page that wasn't. The handwriting was fine, even controlled. Lacey's, I was now certain, but something about the S in silence, the long curve of it, struck me. I compared it to his signature on the will, the same sweeping formation but slightly more fluid, the hand of a man who was no longer careful. I returned to the chapel, not to question, not to observe, just to stand. Sometimes space remembers things the mind won't. The vestry was empty. Evening light slanted through the stained glass window, throwing fractured reds and blues across the stone floor. I moved to the chair where they'd found him, sat, waited. The candle beside it had been replaced, new wick untouched. I leaned back, let the wood creak beneath me, and then I saw it, a small darkened patch on the stone just behind the chair leg. Not blackened, not obvious, but the sort of mark that heat leaves, a smudge of smoke or ash ground into the grain, a candle snuffed not by time but by flame, or something more deliberate. I leaned closer. The scent was faint, almost gone, but I'd spent enough time with wax and wick to know it wasn't simply extinguished. It had burned too far, too fast. Someone had relit it after the service, or replaced it altogether. I stepped back, stared again at the empty space. He makes departure sweet. No, he made departing sweet, the altered tense, the softened subject. Lacey had rewritten not just his will, but his understanding of the end. And someone else, had rewritten it again. Not to honor him, but to erase the intention. The hymn list, the misquoted line, the missing boy, the rewritten date. Each change small enough to overlook. Together, they formed something else entirely. Premature. I didn't call Lewis. Not yet. There are discoveries that require silence first. The kind that feels like kneeling beside something long buried. Outside, the bells marked 7. The hour between daylight and dusk. I stayed a while longer, watching the light retreat. There is a silence particular to music. Not the absence of sound, but the breath held between two notes. Suspended, unresolved. The kind that says more than the chord it precedes. That silence had been following me for days now, threading itself through chapel pews and crossword grids, in the quiet hesitation behind every answer I was given too quickly. It was the boy again. Felix. I returned to him not out of strategy, but inevitability. The way one revisits the first stanza of a poem when the final line doesn't settle right. He was in the rehearsal room this time, perched beside a music stand, bowing his head over the day's anthem with the fixed intensity only a child or a dying man can sustain. Heba looked up and blinked once, not startled, not expectant, just aware. I asked him if he still had the folder from last week, the one Lacey had handed him before the service. He said yes, but he hadn't looked through it again. Something in his voice told me that wasn't quite true. He retrieved it from his satchel. Standard issue, worn at the corners, initials faintly inked near the zip. Inside, photocopied scores, pencil marks, a schedule folded twice over. Nothing unusual, nothing noteworthy. Until I reached the back. The final sheet was thicker than the rest, heavier paper, unmarked. Folded once not quite symmetrically. It wasn't a hymn, it was a letter. Not typed, not formally addressed, just ink on thick parchment, the writing unmistakably Lacey's. The slow, deliberate hand of a man who had never hurried and had never quite belonged to the present century. I read it once, then again. Each time it said something slightly different, not because the words changed, but because the air around them did. It began plainly. If you are reading this, then I have done what I could not say aloud. He didn't name names, didn't point fingers, but the implication was clear. A wrong had been buried in 1963. A boy, unnamed, had died during a rehearsal, not from illness, not from misadventure, but from something else. Something covered in cloth and silence. Carr had handled it, he said. Carr had told him it would be taken care of, and it had been. No questions asked, no record kept, just a page removed from the register and a life erased from the choir roll. Lacey had done nothing, not then. He'd watched, believed, then waited too long to stop believing. The letter ended with a single sentence, all the more damning for its lack of urgency. I sang the wrong notes in silence for too many years. I folded the letter slowly. Its weight felt different now, not just metaphorical. It was heavier than it ought to be. The paper was double thick. I held it up to the window, the pale light of late afternoon glancing across the fibers. There, barely visible, the outline of something pressed between the folds. I eased it apart. A second sheet. Smaller, torn at the edge. It was a photocopy, faint, grainy, of a ledger. The chapel register. May 1963. And there, in faded ink, Andrew C., age 12, listed under deaths. The name had been crossed through once, not quite completely. Someone had tried to make it disappear, not with malice. With hope, perhaps. The hope that forgetting might be kinder than remembering. I asked Felix if he knew what it meant. He shook his head. Said only, Mr. Lacey looked like someone who'd stopped expecting to be forgiven. There was music in the air again. The choir warming up above. Voices rounding into harmony. I left the room slowly, as if afraid that closing the door might lose the note I hadn't yet understood. That night, I poured a drink and laid the 2 sheets out beside the crossword. 9 across, still waited. A truth hidden beneath something sacred. 8. Palisade. It didn't quite fit. But another word whispered itself as I traced the lines of Lacey's confession. Reliquary. A container for something holy. Or once thought so. A vessel built to preserve what time should have taken. I underlined it, then crossed it out. Some truths don't need preserving, only releasing. It was the first Evensong since Lacey's death, though no one said so aloud. Death, in Oxford, is often treated like inclement weather, something endured, acknowledged, but never permitted to alter the schedule. The service would go on. The music would rise as expected. But a shape would be missing from the vestry corridor, a familiar creak absent from the floorboards where he'd once stood. Arms folded, head slightly bowed, as if apologizing to the building for having disturbed it. I arrived early, not from habit, but from a need to observe what happened when absence tries to pretend it is order. The candles were lit already. All 7. No faltering flame this time. Each stood tall, obedient, unaware. Lewis had called that morning. He'd confirmed it. A boy named Andrew Carr, age 12, died in May 1963. Official cause, a fall down the stone steps behind the vestry. Witnesses inconclusive. No further inquiry opened. A church matter, filed and folded. And Father Edward Carr, no relation given, but it didn't take much imagination, had resigned 6 weeks later. No scandal, no notice. Just a line in the records. Transferred to a rural parish in Devon. A transfer is such a gentle word for an exorcism. The choir began to file in, white surplices fluttering like ghosts, trying not to look too theatrical. I counted them without meaning to. 21, the same as the number in the photograph, minus the blurred-out face. They carried their folders with a solemnity I hadn't seen before. Not grief, exactly. Something quieter. The awareness of changed air. I watched Felix settle into his seat. His eyes found mine for a brief moment, then dropped. His folder, I noticed, was newer. A recent replacement. Someone, probably Mrs. Digby, had ensured the old one was retired. Tucked away, maybe. or destroyed. The organ prelude began. Soft, tentative. Not Bach. Something more modern. Darker chords, a minor key that refused to resolve. Beside me, the chapel steward sat with his program folded neatly on his lap. I asked softly whether anyone had found anything unusual in Lacey's quarters. He said no, but his answer was too quick, too polished. A moment later he leaned in, said he'd seen Troughton in the vestry late the night before Lacey died. Said he hadn't thought anything of it at the time, but now it seemed worth mentioning. Troughton, the archivist. I thought of the smudge on his cuff, the missing register page, the pause before he denied knowing Arnold outside the chapel, a man who catalogued omissions for a living. The choir began to sing. Come, Holy Ghost, our souls inspire. It was not a hymn of mourning, but the harmonies moved like something broken trying to stand. The third soprano missed a note, barely, and compensated by drawing out the next with too much clarity. The result was a phrase made longer by uncertainty, and it was in that moment, in the space between the fifth and sixth verse, that I saw it. The empty chair in the shadows behind the altar, the one Lacey used to rest upon briefly before services. It hadn't been removed. No flowers adorned it. No gesture had been made to acknowledge its vacancy. It was simply there, unused. Sometimes the truest memorial is the thing left untouched. After the service, I stood a while in the south cloister, watching the boys spill out in twos and threes, voices beginning to rise again with the return of ordinary things. Coats, umbrellas, supper. Felix passed without speaking, but he gave a small nod. That was enough. I turned back into the quiet. The chapel was nearly empty again. I approached the vestry door, half open. Inside, neatness. Coats hung with military precision. The candle snuffer hung exactly where it always had. But a drawer in Lacey's desk was slightly ajar. Inside, an envelope addressed simply to E.C. Nothing inside, no stamp, no seal, just initials and dust. Carr. It meant something, I thought. Or it didn't. Meaning in Oxford is often decided by what one chooses to forget. Outside, the rain had started again. I stepped into it without hesitation. Some evenings don't require shelter. The case was over, insofar as such things ever are. No arrests, no official inquiry, no triumphant declaration behind a lectern, just the quiet shuffling of papers into folders that would be filed, then forgotten. There are crimes Oxford prefers not to prosecute, especially the ones it buried long ago, under stone and music and the kind of silence that accumulates in places where candles burn but never flicker. Lacey's death remained, officially, a natural one. No inquest reopened. No mention of coercion or guilt or fear disguised as ritual. The boy's name, Andrew Carr, was not reinstated in the register. The scratched-out page would not be restored, and Father Edward Carr had long since vanished into a parish so far from scrutiny that even shame had stopped looking for him. But the music had changed. The next service I attended, not out of duty but something quieter, began as all Evensongs do. Robes, rustling, the echo of a footstep too loud on the chancel floor. A boy fumbling with a note in the psalm that slipped, briefly, into dissonance before righting itself. And yet the tone was different. Not in the hymns themselves, but in their delivery. As if the choir, or perhaps only I, now sang with the knowledge that something once hidden had stirred. Not exposed, not judged, just acknowledged. The chapel was fuller than usual that evening. Word of Lacey's passing had circulated, more widely than expected. A small notice in the Oxford Mail, a whisper among old choir members. Celia Tranter was there, seated toward the back. She wore grey, not black. Her hands remained folded throughout the service, motionless, save for a brief tightening of the fingers during the Nunc Dimittis. Troughton, the archivist, was not present. I had asked Lewis to check his flat earlier that day, not for suspicion, precisely, but because absences demand accounting. The place had been cleared. No note, no forwarding address. A bottle of ink left uncapped on his desk, the chair tucked in too carefully. Some departures are planned with more precision than a timetable would suggest. After the service, I lingered. The candles were still burning, and no one had yet moved to extinguish them. That small detail struck me. The one in the middle, the one that had once failed, flickered, not from wind, but from the effort of staying alight. Felix appeared at my side without announcement. His voice was softer than usual, like someone trying out a different version of themselves. He said, "Mr. Lacey used to hum during the closing hymn. Not loudly, just under his breath. But you could hear it if you stood near the vestry. I didn't notice he'd stopped humming until now. Isn't that strange?" I told him no. Not strange. Just the kind of noticing that matters too late. He nodded, then looked at me. A long look, the sort that doesn't request answers, only recognition. Then he slipped away again, vanishing into the corridor's half-light. I returned home later than usual. The flat was cold, but I didn't turn on the fire. There's a kind of clarity that prefers discomfort. I sat at the desk, the crossword waiting. 3 across, the final sound before silence. 5. Chord, I thought. Or close. But something tugged. A word less precise. More human. Echo. I penciled it in, lightly, not committed. The photograph lay beside the paper, the copy I'd made of the 1963 choir. I stared again at the face that had been scratched out, or rather at the space it had once occupied. The shape of absence. Lacey had tried to preserve something, not a memory, but a reckoning. He hadn't confessed in the ordinary sense. He'd composed it like a slow hymn written in silence, each line careful, unresolved. Justice hadn't come. Not really, but something else had. A shift, a breath held too long finally let out. The candle had gone out too early, yes, but perhaps, just before it did, it had burned with more clarity than anyone had noticed. Outside, the bells of St. Giles began their late chime. Not quite midnight, but close enough. I listened, letting each toll settle. Then, finally, reached for the light.